friends. I'm Dimmer, and this is my co-host, Q.
Hello.
Today, we're talking to Kai. She runs a blog on maladaptive daydreaming and immersive daydreaming, but mostly maladaptive daydreaming is why we have her here today.
Hello.
And we're going to be talking about the fears of quitting with her.
Mm-hmm. All right, Kai. Hello. How you doing today?
I'm doing great, thank you. Good to be here.
Fantastic. So when it comes to quitting, I suppose we should really just kind of start with like the fear itself. I think that'd be a good starting point. Because when it comes to maladaptive daydreaming, we all get really attached to our daydreams and we get really attached to the act of daydreaming. And sort of the fear of losing that, I think, would be a good place to start. Like what your daydreams mean to you and why we're so afraid of leaving them behind. Have you ever been, like, not necessarily deathly terrified of quitting, but been, like, had a fear of leaving your daydreams behind or leaving your characters behind or leaving your worlds behind? Like, what have you ever had a moment where you're terrified of just having it all go away for one reason or another?
Yeah, I think it's probably something that most maladaptive daydreamers have to face at some point because our daydreams are such a huge part of our lives. And so to whether you're trying to leave that behind completely or just reduce it to a more manageable level, it's still a huge change to how you're spending your time. And change is always scary.
Yeah, I would agree with that, especially since daydreaming like this, whether it's maladaptive or not, maybe it becomes maladaptive later. But this style of immersive daydreaming starts very young. Like some people don't get it until later, like their teenage years or whatever. But I would say probably a majority get it much younger than that, and a lot can't even remember a time where their brain didn't do this. It has always been a huge part of their personal identity and how they physically work.
Mm-hmm.
It's like losing a limb.
Yes, exactly.
Or mentally maybe losing friends, right? Because that's sort of how our brains recognize it. Because we get really attached to ourselves. Because it really is just, in many cases, getting attached to ourselves. And sort of leaving yourself behind is something that's terrifying. Because, you know, you mentioned it yourself, Dimmer, humans have an aversion to change.
Yeah, and it can also be the fear of the unknown as well. I've been daydreaming since I was 4. I don't know how to think without it. And so to sort of think, well, how am I going to be if I leave this behind?
Mm-hmm.
It's, yeah, you don't know what it's going to be like until you get there. And so you've got that fear as well of, I don't know if I'm going to enjoy this or I'm going to be able to function if I think differently.
Yeah, and I think it's not only just like the change or like the unknown, but I think it's also like fear of loneliness. Because I feel like the fear of leaving it behind also encompasses a lot of different things, which includes, like we mentioned, changed, unknown, but also like loneliness because you get really attached to and you speak with like your characters in your worlds, you interact with them regularly. And I think sort of removing that, and you, like I had mentioned, and like we've mentioned before in the past, you don't need to leave it behind entirely, but even just minimizing it or, you know, lessening the amount of time you daydream overall, I think is just another one of the many reasons or many things that like terrifies. Like I know it terrified me when I started sort of like waning off of it. But like then you like now with so much time that you're not spending with your characters, it's like what do you do with that time? And it's also because there's a lot of people, you know, we mentioned this before, Dimmer, just not like being in your daydreams, you don't end up making like real social connections in the real world, and then eventually you're in a position where it's like, oh, I don't have nearly as many social connections as I'd like. So you end up relying on your daydreams. And if you remove that, it's like you're removing a social part of yourself. right? At least that's what it feels like.
Yeah, I think that's a big fear is if I take away the daydreaming, what do I actually have left? Because
Mm-hmm.
maladaptive daydreaming drops you into that cycle where you socially isolate.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it well, I mean, it's a fantasy, it's wonderful. Maladaptive daydreamers enjoy their daydreaming, because it's a nice, fulfilling place to be. So when you try to spend more time in reality, it looks awful.
Mm-hmm.
It feels
Yes,
bad.
Feels very bleak, I think.
it
Mm-hmm.
does. And I think it can go even beyond just the social thing. Yes, you're absolutely right. We socially isolate, but often we're behind in life generally. People have maybe struggled in college, maybe they're unemployed, maybe they're in a job where they're not reaching their potential. It affects every aspect of your life. And if you've been maladaptive daydreaming for a long time, real life is probably not the way you want it to be. And if you try and give up on your daydreaming, you're stuck in that reality that was not how you planned your life turning out.
Mm-hmm. I also feel
Yeah.
like I also feel like life alone, like reality, has you sort of engage with it like constantly for one reason or another, however you believe it to be, engages you constantly. Like in terms of the rat race for like job stuff, you mentioned that being not as far in your job as you would like, not having as many social connections. Humans are social creatures, right? There's a lot of things that try to get us to engage with the world around us regularly, and if you're not doing that, you're generally perceived as there's a lot of words for it. The one I would generally pick is like worthless or a loser. That's what I've heard in general from like especially family members of mine who are like, if you're not here and doing this and out of all of these things, you're not you're generally not perceived as like a functioning member of society, right? You're behind, right? And
Lazy is the word
lazy is
I hear a
another
lot.
one,
Yeah.
right? There's a whole lot of negative words and connotations that are associated with not engaging with reality in whatever designed way or whatever, way that a lot of people think of it as. So when you come out of your daydreams into this, not only just bleak world, but world that feels very distant. I also think that's another thing, is it's like the world feels distant. Especially like, even if you get out of your daydreams, it still feels far away, right? Because you haven't been engaging in it as much as other people. So it still feels much farther than usual. But once you get to that world and you start to engage with it, people look at you funny because they're like, "Well, why haven't you been doing this?" And it's hard to describe. Like I tried to describe recently, like when I like I'll like sort of drift off in the car. It's always been a habit of mine. I've never really gotten in any like wrecks. I've never gotten in any, like had any tickets or anything like that. But it's like trying to describe the act of disengaging and sort of going into your daydreaming world, however you do it, wherever you do it, is very difficult to describe to people. Because I feel like once you get out of your daydreams and you start to engage with the world, they're like, "Well, why haven't you been doing this all along?" And I know I have a hard time describing why. Most people, a lot of people don't care to understand, but for those who do, it's hard to describe why you haven't, and it feels bad. I think, right?
Shame, yeah, I feel
Yeah.
like people have a lot of shame.
Mm-hmm. And it's like it's just one of many barriers, right? Because it's like now if you're trying to disengage, let's say you actually as an immersive daydreamer, Kai, um, I'm sure you've come up into your own roadblocks because even if you do sort of come out of maladaptive daydreaming and you can still daydream regularly, but you can't like you still run into a lot of roadblocks while being able to daydream sort of much less, not in a maladaptive way. Have you like run into
Yeah.
any roadblocks like that in real life? Like that sort of like pop up that are sort of kind of like the stuff I'm describing?
I mean, what I was thinking as you were talking about real life feeling a bit distant when you come out of maladaptive daydreaming was it made me think that basically it feels like it's not your life because in your daydreams you had a whole other life and you've probably neglected this real one for a long time. And so when you come back to it, it is going to feel strange. It's going to feel like it's not really yours. And I think people who don't daydream in the way that we do will have a hard time understanding that, because this one reality, that's all they've got. They don't have this whole other life in their imagination like we do.
Mm-hmm.
Not to derail us, but I do want to move on to a different fear.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the very this one's very emotional, but the next one I want to talk about is very pragmatic. Maladaptive daydreaming can often be or develop as a coping skill for people with all kinds of stuff, depression, anxiety. In my personal experience, when I started reducing maladaptive daydreaming, my anxiety spiked. I never even knew I had anxiety because it was being covered. So when you have someone with actual an underlying disorder, depression or something, it can get really scary. There is no shortage of people in our communities who say that when they try to stop daydreaming, they start experiencing, really severe symptoms like suicidal ideation. Like there are people who use maladaptive daydreaming to stay alive.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah, that's another very
Yeah.
tangible, very real, very tall roadblock specifically for because sure, because in a lot of cases, I'm not going to say running, but there's a lot of times, like you mentioned, where maladaptive daydreaming is like your coping skill for things that are very tangible, very real, and very difficult to fix, right? Especially here in the U.S., getting
Yep.
help for getting mental help is very expensive. It's like very taxing, and it is a lot of effort. You're already you're battling with like getting in and out of daydreams every day, trying not to daydream over and over and over. And it's just pulling you and sucking you in like a whirlpool. But now that you're out of the whirlpool, you're finding out that outside of the whirlpool, there's now like a giant kraken that is another part of your brain that's fighting you. So it's like from one battle to the next. And sometimes you're fighting it at the same time, trying to get yourself out of this um, very difficult situation and into a place that you're a bit more happy with. It's a very tough sell for anyone, really. Most people would say, I'd rather just be in my daydreams because it's so much easier. And I don't blame them.
Yeah.
We've mentioned in the past that it's
Yeah.
very much worth the battle, but man, well, it wasn't easy for me. I
It
can
is a
only speak for
battle.
myself right now. Yeah,
Yeah.
it is a battle. It's almost like a
It
war.
is a battle.
It's rough. It very much
Yeah.
is.
And I think, as we know, maladaptive daydreaming, so often it begins as a coping mechanism. It's your way of escaping from something
Hmm.
is too much, too overwhelming for you to deal with. But
Hmm.
that thing doesn't necessarily go away just because you're avoiding it by daydreaming. So when you then try to stop daydreaming or you daydream less, that thing is under there. Like Dimmer
Hmm.
said, you didn't know that you had anxiety because it becomes so automatic. The first moment that you start to feel anxious, it's like, we know what to do with this, daydream. And when you
Hmm.
then try and break that cycle, you've got to deal with that underlying problem. You can't run away from it anymore. And that, obviously, that's a big source of fear, because that thing that you're using your daydreaming to escape from, that was so terrifying in the beginning that you needed to escape from it. It's not going to be any different now.
Does it grow in size, though? That's my question. And I think it depends on the person. That's the sort of answer I'm coming to. Because sometimes anxiety or depression or other comorbid disorders end up getting worse over time. But I think in general, like specifically for if you want to get better, I think just immediately assuming that the problem gets larger, the less you deal with it, I think is just a really daunting idea. So I'd say for things like for those comorbid disorders in general, I think they're just still there. Because sorry, I might have gotten a little off topic with it, but I thought to myself, well, if I'm trying to explain these battles to someone who wants to go through with them. I think just saying that over time things get progressively worse is just a really daunting thing to say to someone who's in a very precarious
Yes.
situation in the first place. So I don't think, and for some people maybe it gets larger, but I think in general it doesn't. It just is still there. It just grows up with
It's
you,
still
right?
there, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, yes, you're absolutely right. It's not that it's necessarily got worse. It's that your coping mechanism of daydreaming is not in itself helping you to solve the problem. And so, to my mind, the way to go is to find some other coping mechanism that does help you to solve the problem, whether that's therapy or going on medication or just finding a support group or whatever that may be. But if you can't get rid of maladaptive daydream as a coping mechanism, if there is something you still need to cope with, you will need a coping mechanism of some sort. And it's just about finding a healthier one than your daydreaming.
And I think something that is often overlooked is that because maladaptive daydreaming is often acquired at a young age, even if it's acquired in your teens, is that over time, like all these sort of battles that you're fighting, even if they did get like more difficult or they've gotten larger, like as a person, we all grow older and are more adept. Like over time, we become more adept at solving these problems, even if it is by like a slightly smaller margin, right? Even if the problem gets larger, because
Yes.
when you acquire your maladaptive daydreaming, your MD at a very young age, let's say like 7 or even like 13 or 14, right? If you're now like 18 or like 20 or even older than that, well, you've been alive long enough to where like your body and your brain has caught up or has grown to the point at which you are more adept at solving these problems, right? So
Yes.
people I think often overlook the fact that they have grown. Maybe they've grown up um, in their daydreams quite a bit, but they've still grown.
I think people see that as a negative. You would not believe how many young people, 22 years old, saying that it's too late for them.
Mm-hmm.
And here at
And that
38,
makes me
like
so
that sounds
mad
wild.
because,
Mm-hmm.
my big life transition when I reinvented myself, I did that at 49. And that was
Mm-hmm.
not too late. It cannot be too late when you are still in your 20s.
Well, it's super strange. I think it's because of the social pressures that are put on a lot of people at like between 18 and like 25. They're like, okay, this is the turning point in my life. If I'm not at XYZ point in my life, I've failed, etc., etc. We've just put like a lot of pressure at that point. So I can understand. As someone who
Yes.
recently came out of that time period in their life, like I can totally get it. I see exactly why. It's because
Yeah.
even if you're in your daydreams most of the time, there's a lot of people that will tell you that you're like we've just arbitrarily picked 18 as like the point at which like the measuring stick. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yes.
Hmm. So it's like I can completely understand where they're coming from. I was talking about this with a bunch of people that, especially for like college in general, it's like whenever you graduate college, it doesn't matter. It just all it does is like determine when you can like lay back in like your 30s and 40s, right? To like sort of like relax a bit easier. So it's like, but it doesn't matter, right? If everyone tells you that at 18 years old or at 20 years old, if you're not checking off all of these boxes on like life's checklist or whatever, you start to feel, even if you like, it doesn't matter if you do know it, if you don't know it like explicitly, like you have a general sense of, oh, I'm falling behind, whether it be like behind or further behind. And I feel like in a lot of cases, trying to stop maladaptive daydreaming makes you feel behind no matter what you're doing. Um,
Yeah.
you find yourself in a position where like you just have this general sense of, I'm not at this X point in life. It's too late because I didn't hit X milestone at X Y year. It's just, and I totally get it. It's because you're told that over and over and over again. So it's like very difficult to imagine a world in which that's not the case. But realistically, you'll be fine. It feels bad because there's like this social pressure, but like you said, Kai, you did it. You said in your early 40s, your 40s ish,
No, late 40s.
late 40s. You don't sound like in your late 40s. You sound much
I
earlier.
was 49, and I
Hmm.
completely reinvented myself, and it's been the best thing that ever happened to me. But yeah, I
Fantastic,
certainly did
Kai.
that a lot older than most people.
You are a perfect example of whatever like point in your life, what like whether it be like young or older, right? You can totally do it. It's completely reasonable, even though it seems really difficult, and oftentimes it is. It like the time frame, it doesn't exactly, it doesn't matter all that much, right? You're never too old.
It doesn't matter. And I
Hmm.
think the other thing that comes in with this is that as you get older, you kind of get more options. So, for example, while you're still a child, your parents are making all the decisions about where you go to school, who you can hang
Hmm.
out with, and then you kind of have to make that sort of transition as you get older to start
Hmm.
being able to make some of these decisions for yourself.
Hmm.
And I think that's a very gradual process. A lot of people at 18, they may be going off to college, they haven't got a lot of money, so that's still going to limit their options a lot. And as you get older, you just have more possibilities.
Specifically money wise, it costs in many places it costs money to help with the mental disorder or the comorbid disorders that end up cropping up when you sort of like wane off of your daydreaming a little bit. So I think the older you get, it might be a little bit easier to sort of work with that. But it just feels very hopeless when you're young. I know it felt hopeless for me while I was in university. That was rough. But it's still just like it's still possible.
I think particularly if you've been daydreaming for a long time as well, you're not in tune with who you really are and what you really want from life. And that's another reason why when you're younger, maybe you're not super focused on one particular career, for example. You haven't got these goals that you're pursuing because you don't
Hmm.
really know what you want from real life because you're spending all your time in your daydream world, probably being
Hmm.
somebody that's not quite you. I think it
Hmm.
disconnects you from what you want in reality. And so you do end up being that much older before you really have a clear idea of where you want your life to go. And I think that ties
Hmm.
back into what we're talking about with the fear of quitting, that if you don't really know who the real world you is, that's another
Hmm.
reason why you're going to be quite terrified of being forced to find out.
Hmm.
Absolutely. Yeah. I feel like a lot of maladaptive daydreamers, when they kind of, surface from it in their 20s, they're entering the workforce and stuff.
Hmm.
That is a strange time in life to realize you don't know who you are. Like,
Hmm.
uh, it's
I'm not.
jarring.
I think I'll partially disagree. I feel like there's a lot of people who don't daydream that also find themselves in that position. So I feel like in that regard, they're not exactly super behind. I just think that a lot of people don't like look inward or go soul searching for lack of a better term. So I think for those of you out there who don't know exactly what you want, just know that there's a lot of people who don't maladaptive daydream that don't know what they want either. Now, granted, you still don't, you still might not know. Uh, in that case, in that regard, Kai and Dimmer are very much correct. But I feel like you might not be as far behind as you think you are, or at least far behind as people might tell you to those in the audience. So in that regard, you're beating them out too. You're ahead of the curve for them.
Yeah, I think that is such an important point, actually, because we tend to blame everything that goes wrong in our lives on our maladaptive daydreaming. And we tend to assume that everyone who doesn't daydream has got their shit together. And that's just not the case.
specifically, because I feel like for anyone, I know for me, I am an adult, and I've been an adult for X amount of years, and I feel like a kid sometimes. I feel like I'm not exactly super mature, but there's a lot of people who act immature, um, and that's just another example of people not, uh, maybe not exactly like growing up. I don't think is the right word, but there's a lot of people who don't have their stuff together. They're like they have demons that they're not fighting, right? Because like for if you are a maladaptive
Yeah.
daydreamer and you're attempting to curb your daydreaming, I feel like that's just what I would call a demon that you're trying to fight. Because each of us has our own internal demons that we're working with and attempting to beat or trying to minimize. But there's some people out there who seem to have them and aren't even trying. Right? They're putting it out on full
Yeah.
display for others to see. Everyone knows the Karen archetype. Many of you have dealt with them. So it's like that's just an example of demons that they're not even attempting to fight. They just assume the world is theirs. Right? There's a lot of people like that. So that's your just fine. I feel like a lot of maladaptive daydreamers and people in general don't have. Maybe it's not confidence, but a lot of people just telling them that they're fine isn't enough. So I feel like giving an example or two of like why it's never too late and why fighting your demons is worth it, and why you're not exactly as far behind as you might think. Is giving examples of that is nice because it makes it more tangible. I think. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
I
Mhm.
I think that relates to also like, oh wow, I'm not articulate enough to express the thought I just had.
Mhm.
That often people when they are trying to curb their MD, assuming there's nothing else going on, uh, they feel like they're behind, not because they're comparing themselves to their peers, but because they're comparing themselves to a fantasy version of the world.
Or
Um,
themselves, a fantasy version of
Yeah,
themselves too.
yeah. Or to the version of themselves that they would have been if they were not a daydreamer.
yes.
And in a lot of cases, that might not exactly be true. A lot of people have temperaments and like world views, or I guess it's called frames of reference. Like you'll have a frame of reference of life. Likely your little slice of life is different than you believed it to be. When you get out in reality and you start engaging with the world, like it's different. The frame of reference from your daydreams are different from your frame of reference in real life. Right.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's another distinction is it's like being, it's hard to imagine yourself as different. I know when I was daydreaming a lot, I imagined myself to be a different person than I actually turned out to be. I turned out to be significantly more evil. But the me that I wanted to be was a very good person. Um, which was a bit of a, I'm not, well, actually, yes, I do have to concede it was a bit of a shock. And it was difficult for me to concede and internalize that I'm not as nice of a person as I thought I was. I'm not the lawful good kind of person that I wish to be. Right? I'm more of a chaotic neutral, but that's like if you wanted to simplify it for those who are having a hard time using the alignment chart. That's pretty common, especially online. Is a pretty decent way to sort of place what you believed yourself to be before and what in reality you sort of find yourself doing on the regular. I think is a good way to sort of make that distinction as a start. Right? The world's very nuanced. People are very nuanced. Right? We're very complicated. Humans are very complicated. But just to sort of simplify it for people who are having a hard time, I think the alignment chart is a good place to start. And then, of course, go from there, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. In my experience, kind of similar. Not that I'm evil,
Mhm.
but yeah, and I don't daydream about myself either. So this also happens to people who do not daydream about themselves. That my characters are nothing like me. They don't have Netflix and stuff. they have ambition, and they work hard, and they have very deep, meaningful connections between each other. But that is all happening in my head. I've never put any of my stats into doing that in the real world. So when you come out of it and you have no deep emotional connections, you have no friends who are as close as you think friends should be, that is also very jarring. That is also not the person you want to be. You want to be somebody who can love as deeply as you imagine love can be. And when you have not practiced emotions in the real world, you're just not going to have them. They're not going to be there. So I feel like in my daydreams, I can experience a lot of deep emotion, and in my real world, I really don't have big highs and lows. I'm just kind of meh.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that in itself is another reason why people are afraid of quitting, isn't it? Because the emotions that we know, we spend a lot of time reminding ourselves that our daydream worlds are not real, our characters are not real, but the emotion that we feel while we're daydreaming is real. And
is real, yeah.
It's probably bigger and more fulfilling than the emotions we're getting in the real world. So obviously we don't want to give that up.
We are social creatures, and if you don't think that you can attain that socialness in the real world, you're gonna go elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
And I think we as social creatures naturally we can reach a lot of emotion. We like very high and low emotions. We can reach a lot of emotional fulfillment in real life. But it is hard to grasp, especially when starting out. I think a lot of the things we're talking about is especially difficult starting out. It becomes easier over time because you become more well acclimated to life, to feeling these emotions in real life, seeing the world not as a bleak sort of copy of your daydreams, but instead a very vibrant, a very vibrant life that it actually is. It's just hard to see at the start because you're transitioning from something that is immediately and sometimes artificially vibrant to something that is actually vibrant, but you gotta see the forest for the trees if you kind of catch my drift here.
Absolutely. I think that word you used is right on. Reacclimate. You have to reacclimate.
Mm-hmm.
I think you're so right about when you're starting out, because when you start to make a connection with someone in real life, you've got that little dance. What's okay in this relationship? How much can I share of myself? What does this person think of me? In your daydream, you're in control of all of that. You know your characters are not going to reject you. You can say whatever you want to say. You can go deep way quicker than you could in real life. It's a totally different dynamic.
Mm-hmm. And I think you touched on a point that we've kind of been dancing around a little bit, or maybe we just kind of missed because we haven't talked about relationships, like interpersonal relationships yet. Is rejection. There's a lot of people who will just reject the way that you think, reject who you are, and reject the fact that you daydreamed in the first place. I can't tell you how many times somebody was like, "That's not real. I daydream too," or someone will be like, "Oh, I'm a maladaptive daydreamer. I daydream a lot." It's like, ooh,
Mm-hmm.
that's not it, and I
Yes.
have to explain to them in a way that they understand because I do recently. I've been made aware that people speak in different languages, and I'm not talking like French, German, like Taiwanese, or like Portuguese, stuff like that, uh, Venezuelan. No, I'm not talking those kinds of languages. I mean that within the same like English or German, within the same language, people take things differently. I was recently made aware that my family, like if I say something. I say, "Oh, I've been applying for jobs." I said this when I was applying for jobs. Well, I'm applying for jobs a lot. I think I'm doing it too much. I think I'm going to need a day off, right? And just not apply on maybe Mondays. But I said that, and my family took it as, "Oh, I'm going to stop applying for jobs entirely." How that happened, I have no idea. But I was made aware that it is a thing that happens. People will say one thing, and then the recipient will hear something entirely different. So in terms of interpersonal relationships, that's something that's often glossed over. I didn't know that was a thing until I had to be actively told by someone who was an expert in the subject of interpersonal relationships and things like that, because they study it. But that's something else that you know exactly what you're saying, and the recipient of what you're saying in your daydreams is a character of yours. So it's you talking to you. You know exactly the meaning of what you're saying. They get the meaning of what you're saying
Yes.
exactly. In real life, people, I think it's what is it? Telephone is the game. Yellow telephone, I think maybe. But you'll say one thing and it'll turn into another in the mind of the recipient, which is just another. It's a sort of thing that a lot of people don't understand, even the recipient who doesn't quite understand your words, and it's something that's, I think, in many cases often overlooked as well, because you're not the same person and they just don't quite understand. People, like I said earlier, people are nuanced, people are complicated. Communication is also complicated, so you got to get used to that as well once you're getting reacclimated to real life.
I think what you're saying leads into another fear I wanted to talk about. So that sense of isolation there and misunderstanding, I think, is a big part of it. That when people, think about quitting or curbing or reducing their daydreaming, they kind of have this sense that they are in it alone because the people around them aren't going to understand. How can you share this part of yourself when it is so often just taken the absolute wrong way? Like, oh, that's not real, or oh, I do that too. And and then the practical side of having to go it alone, where therapy costs $150 a session and Lexapro costs $4 a bottle. Like,
And even if you go to therapy, there are many therapists who will just brush you off, which is technically not what they're supposed to do. It's like the
Yeah.
one thing they're not supposed to do, but not all of them do it. But I've
Yeah.
had instances where I'm like, I just paid this person to insult me.
yeah, so then you're faced with figuring all this out, but like we have to be our own researchers. If a maladaptive daydreamer wants to get better, really their only recourse at this point is to learn everything they can about it. You have to become your own researcher. You have to become your own advocate. You have to apply your own therapy that you've thought up because there is no treatment protocol. You have to figure out if you have an underlying illness. Hopefully you get help with that. Hopefully you can, like if you have ADHD or something, it might cost you some money, but it's not a particularly difficult diagnosis.
And you'll notice, Dimmer, that you just add another hurdle with each sentence. It's just like another hurdle that you got to jump through.
And you're facing all of that alone.
And none of them are
It
particularly
is
high on their
hard.
own. Yes, it's very difficult.
But yeah, when it's all of it.
Yes, the small hurdles tend to like build up into something much, much larger.
I was just going to say that everything that Dimmer was just listing there, they're all things that a good therapist should be able to help you do that. Yes, you're the one figuring it out because they probably don't know what maladaptive daydreaming is, but a good therapist should be able to come on that journey with you. But the problem is that so many maladaptive daydreamers won't even talk about this in therapy. Literally the safest environment you've got somebody who is paid not to judge you, it's a completely confidential space, and yet people still can't talk about their daydreaming in therapy. And this is something I've struggled with myself as well. My therapist does not know all of it. She knows quite a lot, but not everything, because it's just so hard to talk about. And that's for those of us that are lucky enough to have therapy, because as we've already touched on, it's just too expensive for many people anyway.
Yeah, I did the same thing when I went to therapy. I told her about it. I was like, so I didn't name it. I didn't tell her the name of it, but I was like, so I do this thing and I want you to know about it because it's a big part of my life. And I can't like speak openly about what I'm doing with my time if you don't know about it. But I don't want to address it. That's not what I'm here for. I'm here for this other issue. Uh, and she asked questions. I think just to filter out that it wasn't a hallucination, it wasn't a delusion, it wasn't some form of psychosis or anything. She just ran me through a couple diagnostic questions to weed out more serious issues. And that was it. But yeah, I did the same thing in therapy. Like I brought it up a little bit and then was like, but we're not talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep. And I feel like not just like it. There's a prevailing sentiment in the maladaptive daydreaming communities or the maladaptive daydreaming spaces online is that therapy is not a place to go because there's been a lot of people who have had very negative experiences with it, and I feel like like clearly there's um, a lot of bad therapists out there. There's a lot of very bad or very poor practitioners of almost any job. But I feel like it's like not going to therapy. I feel like going to therapy is overall a good thing in general. It's just that there are many cases where you kind of got to find the right one, if that makes sense. Because you did mention, Kai, that a good
Yes.
therapist can do all these things, but you got to find
Oh,
and
yes.
and it's like if you
You
have the
do.
money.
And sadly, yeah, it comes down to money. I think so often with therapy, you get what you pay for. And so
Mm-hmm.
many maladaptive daydreamers, if they're not where they want to be in their careers, money is going to be an issue. You're going to gravitate towards the cheaper options.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. And it just ends up being something where you have to end up shopping around. And if that means slowly increasing the price of the therapy that you're going for, then yes, that might be something you have to do. But it's like it's very hard to explain, or it's very hard to convince someone to go there when like a bottle of alcohol is like $20 or less, right? Or like certain like over-the-counter medications like NyQuil or something like that is like maybe $10. It's like for someone who can't exactly pay for therapy, it's like you have like cheaper options. And there's a lot of places, at least in the U.S., where you can just like buy weed or do that instead. It's very hard to convince someone to go to therapy when you have cheaper options that, in a lot of cases or some cases, end up doing a similar, not as positive, and certainly not going to fix the problem like a therapist would. But like people will just point to that and say, "Hey, I can do this instead. I think I'll do it because it's a fraction of the price." And I know I've had not exactly from maladaptive daydreaming, but it's like explaining this to people. They're like, "Oh, just do this. It's like a fraction of the cost." And I think to myself, it's very hard. It's a very difficult thing to convince someone when there's other options out there like that.
I'm right there with them. I'm right there with them. Like that example I brought up before, I
Mm-hmm.
is the example from my real life. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's a few $100s to sit down with a therapist. And I can only afford so many sessions a month before our
Mm-hmm.
budget is tapped out. And even then, like that's money that could have been spent on my son's saxophone or fixing my goddamn washing machine, which has been broken for months. So
Mm-hmm.
I had to have that conversation with my husband about like, what am I really getting out of this that I'm
Mm-hmm.
not getting out of the $4 Lexapro,
Yep.
you know?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then you have to end up making concessions in on this journey to helping yourself be more acclimated to real life and sort of curbing your daydreams. You run into a lot of issues like this. Some people run into them more than others, depending on where they are in life and depending on sort of their situation. But it's like you have to end up making a lot of concessions, which just ends up raising. So like we have a lot of these small hurdles, like we had mentioned before, but like stuff like this, setbacks like that, and concessions you have to make raise some of the hurdles like a little bit, or in some cases a lot. So to like get past them, you have to work like so much harder. So that's just another daunting thing to a lot of people when curbing or reducing their daydreams. Is they say, well, if I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, they're all very expensive, right? Or they're all very difficult to get through, or I'm maybe out in a very remote area, so like my social connections that I can make are very limited. That's another one, right? Depending on where you live, you might find certain hurdles higher than others, and then the internet can make that easier for social connections, depending, and there's ways to lower these, and there's ways to sort of circumvent some hurdles. It's just you got to make these concessions, and the only person who can decide what concessions to make, how to make them, and like what you should do is you. Right? There's no like guide, right? There's people who can give advice based on their own experiences, and give you sort of a rough path. But the fact that you have to do it yourself because it's based entirely on your own experiences and your own situation is just something that's very difficult for a lot of people now. Not just maladaptive daydreamers, but people in general, sort of taking control and like sort of taking control of your own life and steering your own ship is very, very, it's scary. It really is.
It is, and I think that's so important. And I think it's one of the things that's quite particularly difficult for maladaptive daydreamers, because this all happens in our head. Nobody is going to fix this for you. You have to do it. It's not like if you have a substance addiction, you can maybe go to rehab and someone will take away your access to it while you work on the addiction. Nobody can take away our thoughts. We have to fix this ourselves.
And the whole time you're doing this, you have that tantalizing piece of cake that's your maladaptive daydreaming, like sitting in front of you.
And you think, oh, just 5 minutes. 5 minutes isn't going to be a problem, is it? And we all know that it's never
That
just
4
5
hours
minutes.
later, 8 hours later, you come back and you're like, oh my God, I ate the whole cake. I'll just have a bite.
Yes,
but the whole cake's gone.
That's exactly it.
I say that all the time. Like, I'll spend 6 hours daydreaming, and then somebody comes in like, all right, we got to go do this. I'm like, 5 more minutes.
Yep. And
It's
then
never enough.
And then you eat the whole cake, and then suddenly the cake's back on the table again. And you're like, how did that get there? And it's like, okay, well, okay. I can't tell you how many times I'm like, oh, I got to get my studying done for this test. And then I eat the whole cake. And then there's a second cake, but this time it's chocolate cake, which is even tastier. And it's like, I have literally 24 hours before I have to take my Calculus 3 exam. What I don't want, I want the chocolate cake. I want it. I want it. I want it. I don't want it. I want it. I don't want it. Right? And then you get into this like where you're like, and I feel like sometimes you get paralyzed with that decision where it's like you have the cake sitting in front of you, but you really need to eat your veggies. Right? And that just causes a whole ton of not only like mental stress, but it's like, and sometimes in many cases actually like a lot of physical stress as well. So add that to the pile,
So you sorry, you just made me have another thought, another fear that I want to bring up.
Yep.
I have a calculus test in 6 hours. And
Yep.
and I think maybe this fear is a little bit overlooked, but I think it is real that maybe you just suck. Maybe you're a shitty human being. You're lazy. You're lazy as shit, and you don't actually have what it takes to pass your calculus test. You don't actually have what it takes to have a successful career. But maladaptive daydreaming, you have an explanation. You have an excuse for why you suck. And if you take that away, are you going to find out that you're never going to be anything? I think people are scared of that.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. It's giving yourself an excuse, isn't it? It's like I can blame all the things I haven't done on the fact that I was daydreaming instead. Take away the daydreaming, I don't have that excuse anymore.
And I think in terms of this fear overall it's like you don't have to be. So I had mentioned earlier with the rat race where you have to make a bunch of money, you have to be really high up in your company, and you have to do, make $1 billion and all this other stuff. It's like I think it's what's also overlooked is it's like maybe you're not cut out to, I don't know, be the greatest researcher on the planet, right? But I think it's also often overlooked that you don't have to be the greatest on the planet, right? Some people are just not very good at math. Some people are just better at math, right? And because I pick math because we all know how math is, right? Math is made by lunatics for lunatics, right? And maybe I personally am not super bad at it, but I know a lot of people who just don't get it, which is understandable because, well, it's math. And for things like that, it's like people are just good at different things, I think. And no one has to be the great. Like you don't have to be the greatest. And sure, in school, maybe you have to complete this calculus exam. Right, but it's like just because you don't get an A at the calculus exam doesn't mean you're the worst person on the planet, doesn't mean you're exactly a shitty person. I feel like the rat race has kind of infected people's brains in a way that makes you feel way worse than you should for like doing poorly on an exam, right? It's like you learn the most from failure, and I feel like a lot of people overlook that, not exactly because they overlook it because they're told to overlook it. They've told from a very young age that failure is bad, right? And I'm not talking about just not doing anything, right? Um, because I think this is sort of tangentially related to not having an excuse for doing poorly. Doing poorly shows you where you can improve. And I think that's a conversation for like an improvement conversation, right? Because everything is done incrementally, especially improving like your life situation, your interpersonal relationships, and where you are in real life compared to where you are in your daydreams. I feel like that's a conversation for like specifically improvement and improving yourself in real life. So that's a whole topic on its own. So I guess ultimately I'd shorten it to not having an excuse for being bad. I don't think it's a bad thing to just not be good at things. Does that make sense? I got a little twisted up there.
No, it makes sense. And I love that you said that we learn through failure, because of course in our
Hmm.
daydreams we don't. We never fail.
Hmm. Yep.
So it's something that maladaptive daydreamers aren't used to thinking of failure like that. You never
Hmm.
give ourselves the chance to learn. Well, the other aspect to it is that to learn from failure, you have to reflect on it. And we don't do a lot of
Hmm.
reflection either, do we? We daydream instead. So I think this whole learning from failure thing is something that doesn't come very naturally to us, and we have to actually think about it.
Hmm. And for those in the audience, this is another example of not just maladaptive daydreamers, but there are a lot of people who don't have maladaptive daydreaming who don't go soul searching. They don't have introspection. They don't reflect on their actions. They don't seek improvement, right? So if you're a maladaptive daydreamer who struggles with that, there's a lot of people who also do, or they just simply don't try. They don't ever want to be wrong. They can't be wrong. They do a lot of mental gymnastics to, explain away their failure, right? It's like maladaptive daydreamers in many cases actually are not that much different to normal people. It's just that normal people people who don't maladaptive daydream, people who don't maladaptive daydream just don't have maladaptive daydreaming as an excuse, so they pick like 100 different other excuses, right? It's just that our excuse for whatever problem we might have is maladaptive daydreaming. So if you feel like you're way behind in that regard as well, you're doing perfectly fine. There's a lot of people who are doing the exact same.
Um, to shift gears a little bit, because we're kind of coming sort of towards the end of our time,
Hmm.
but I don't want us to end, on a downer or anything. So, I kind of want to go back through some of these fears and talk about how they can be overcome or how they are unfounded. And I think the one that is the best to start with is that this false dichotomy of all or nothing when it comes to maladaptive daydreaming. Like, even in the
Hmm.
title of this, we're using the word quitting, but that's not exactly what it is. It's not be a maladaptive daydreamer or lose everything and never be able to daydream your characters again. You don't have to be in a place where you lose them. On this podcast, we often talk about, reduction instead of cutting it out completely. Like, I personally am a lot better. I'm getting a lot closer to being comfortable with the label immersive daydreaming. I'm still a maladaptive daydreamer, but I think I'm coming towards the and not end, but the peak of my recovery. And my daydreams aren't gone. I don't have to miss my characters. I don't have to get rid of them to be healthy. So I want to get rid of that fear right away. Quitting, air quotes, does not mean you lose it forever.
Mm-hmm. Maybe quitting alone might be a misnomer. I think like just reduction alone is fine, or I think just reducing your daydreams to a level that is a bit more comfortable. Not comfortable in the way that you're completely enveloping yourself in your daydreams, but comfortable in a way that you can sort of balance your daydreams with the life that you wish to live, the life that you're living, but enjoy or are comfortable with. I think hitting that medium, like you mentioned, is sort of the goal. And you don't need to drop them entirely. That's sort of something that a lot of people, I think that alone is the fear, right? That you have to sort of go one way or the other, right?
I think that's a huge one that stops a lot of people from even trying to begin with.
Yes.
There's a lot of nuance to like sort of like we've mentioned a bunch. It's not like an easy one-time fix. It's it's not easy, but it doesn't mean it has to be like world-endingly difficult, right? You just take it one step at a time, and it takes a little bit of time. It takes it takes time, but when sort of lowering it, we in previous episodes we've listed sort of ways that you might be able to help yourself sort of lower the amount of daydreams that you have, but being afraid of removing it all is reasonable. I think we all have that sort of fear. Even those with immersive daydreaming have a fear of just removing it entirely because we've been daydreaming for so long, or maladaptive daydreaming or immersive daydreaming for so long. We have that fear, and everybody has that fear, right? So you're not alone in any capacity. It's totally normal, but removing it all, I don't think is actually the goal. I mean, maybe it is, right? Maybe it's the ideal to aspire to, but the reality is you can live with your daydreams just fine.
Yes, I tend to think of it as we talk about quitting, or I tend to say overcoming maladaptive daydreaming. What you're quitting is the maladaptive part, not the daydreaming part. And if your daydreaming is genuinely immersive daydreaming, it's not getting in the way of whatever it is you want to do in real life, you no longer have a problem. And you also no longer have maladaptive daydreaming, you have immersive daydreaming.
And in that regard, I believe it's the addiction that's really the core issue here. It's not that you're daydreaming all the time. It's not the daydreaming itself. It's the fact that the cake is on the table and you have a very difficult time leaving it on the table.
Yes, it's the lack of control.
Yep. And if you see the cake, you eat the cake. That's the problem. It's fine to have the cake there. It's fine for you to have nice little sweets on the table. You just need to take the little bit by bit. Just don't eat the whole cake when it appears. It's like if you sort of feel yourself daydreaming, it's not that you completely leave it alone. It's that you just do it a teensy bit at a time, right? So that it's not eating up your life. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Fantastic. And for those of you out in the audience, I'm sure there's a lot of you who find yourself in a position where this is all, like we have mentioned. We mentioned a lot in this episode, which is all very daunting and terrifying. But I would like to remind everybody that it is very doable. It's not like something a lot of people are still going through it. A lot of people have achieved sort of a balance that they're comfortable with. The balance is different for everyone. And it is not impossible by any means. Don't let what we've said in this episode deter you. We've only this episode specifically is just about fears that people might have. We have previous episodes doing things that might help. just know, I'll repeat it one more time, it is completely doable, completely achievable, and while it might be difficult, especially in the beginning, you can totally achieve it. You can totally do it.
And just, well, I would just add to that, and although therapy is helpful if it is accessible to you, you can totally do it without therapy. It might be a bit harder, but it's still possible. Don't think just because you can't find a therapist or you can't afford a therapist that makes it impossible for you. It just makes it a bit harder, maybe.
Mm-hmm. It just raises one of the hurdles just a little bit higher. And that should be it. Dimmer, do you want to do the outro this time around? So I can sort of get back into the swing of things. I'm making you do all the work.
Yeah. Sure. No, yeah, that's fine. Do we have any final thoughts or anything?
You all are a bunch of beautiful people, wonderful daydreamers, and I wish the best for your recovery.
I would just say this has been a really fun conversation. I've totally enjoyed it, and I hope some of the people listening get some real value out of it.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
I hope they do too, because I think for every one of these fears that we've talked about, there is a way to overcome it. Like it's not. The fear is never what you think it is.
Mm-hmm. And it's not exactly as large as we or somebody else might make it out to be. And people, and like there's it's the classic, there's 100 ways to skin a cat. There's a bunch of different ways, like a ton of solutions for each one of these problems. You just got to find the one that works for you.
Yeah,
only you can stop forest fires.
And that's going to do it for this episode of Parallel Lives. And I know we always tell the audience, to like, share, and comment. But on this episode specifically, I would like people to comment how they have overcome specific fears, or what they're trying out for them. Give each other ideas, because a lot of people are afraid to even start. So if you've been there, help a girl out.
Yeah.
So yeah.
For all the ladies and gentlemen out there.
Yep. Like, comment, subscribe, share. We're on Anchor, Apple, Spotify, YouTube. I was say Google. We're on YouTube as well. Yeah, and thank you, Kai, for coming. Just to shill a little bit here, should have said it at the top, but Kai is an MD blogger. Her blog is called The Daydream Place, and God, there's so many articles on there. I wouldn't even know. Let me see. I have it right here. What do you have recently? Should you stop completely or convert to immersive daydreaming? Will you get withdrawal? You're not too old and it's not too late. Why it's good that it's not real. That's just what's up this week. And there's, oh my God, how long have you been doing this? There are articles since 2020.
Yeah, it's been a while now.
That's great. There's a lot of good stuff on there, you guys. Go check it out.
Take a look, enjoy it, read it, have fun, enjoy yourself. It's very good. And they're well written too.
Oh, thank you.
Is this the outro, Dimmer?
That was the outro, yeah. That was...
That's it? All right.